Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile. Welcome to Unit 8. I have decided to divide Unit 8 into two units. The first part is going to be a discussion of fragments in Android. Fragments typically we use in larger layouts or larger formats like tablets, but they do have a use in phone layouts as well. It's just a more limited use. So I thought it was important to discuss fragments as sort of sub-activities within an activity before we get into other things that we can do with views. So here we go. What is a fragment? Well, a fragment is a self-contained kind of sub-activity or division of an activity. They can have a user interface or they can be without a user interface to do some tasks, processing tasks in the background. But fragments have their own life cycle, just like activities have their own life cycle. Now, a fragment life cycle depends somewhat upon the activity's life cycle, and we'll see that here in the next slide. Fragments also receive their own input events. Fragments always exist within an activity, but there can be multiple fragments in one activity. One example of this would be a larger layout, say on a tablet, where we have multiple fragments all controlled by one activity. And it looks like we might have many activities within one layout, but we can't do that. One activity, one layout, but we can have multiple fragments all being controlled within an activity. We can switch fragments in and out, we can hide them, we can delete them, we can add them, and do all sorts of things. So they become a very powerful user interface tool. A fragment can either have a user interface, or it might exist without a user interface. And an example of that would be some piece of code that we want to have separate from other code in the activity that is doing something more or less in the background. So we said fragments have their own life cycle. The life cycle of a fragment is dependent upon the life cycle of the activity. They always exist, though, within the context of an activity. When the activity is paused, all fragments within the activity are paused. When the activity is destroyed, all fragments also go away that are within that activity. But while the activity is in a resume state, we can deal with each of these fragments independently, and we can add them and remove them from the activity. And so that's where the fragment activity life cycle is enabled, if you will. So there are some things that happen. Fragments each have their own onCreate, onStart, onResume, onStop, and onDestroy methods that are analogous to the activities methods, each with the same name. And they're all called back to the fragment, not the activity. There are some additional methods that help us manage communication of the fragment and its activity. So there is onAttach, that's called when a fragment has been associated with an activity. And I should mention that all of these methods are also part of the fragment, not the activity. So onAttach, onCreateView happens when the activity has added the fragment and the fragment's view is about to be created, and it's used to create the fragment's view if the fragment will have a view. So anytime a fragment has a view, we need to override onCreateView and do something with it. OnActivityCreated is called in the fragment when the activity's onCreate method has returned. OnDestroyView is called when the fragment's view is being removed, and onDetach is called when the fragment is actually being removed from the activity. So fragment callbacks only occur when the activity itself is in specific states. So let's say onDestroyView, or the fragment's onDestroy method, can't be called while the activity is in the created state. It can only be called when the activity is in the destroyed state. So these activity states that go with these fragment callback methods are listed here. When the activity is in the created state, in order, the fragments onAttach, then onCreate, then onCreateView, and then onActivityCreated methods are called. And again, they're in that specific order. So while the activity is being destroyed, on the other end, the fragments onDestroyView, and then onDestroy, then onDetach methods are called in that order. Every other method in the callback of the fragment is called when the activity is in the corresponding state. So the fragments on start is called right after the activities on start method is called. On resume, on pause, on stop, similarly. So let's talk a little bit about a fragment. A fragment is a class, and we have a subclass or a extending of the class fragment or one of its subclasses within our application code. The fragment has a layout, just like the activity has a layout. The simplest way to set up a fragment within the activity is to simply add a fragment tag within the activity's layout XML. And that looks like this. A fragment must have a name, and this is going to resolve to the class name of the fragment. And it must have some kind of ID, either an ID or tag or something assigned it to by the system, but the simplest way to manage this is to use Android ID. And then it can have other attributes. It can have a width and height and so forth. But at minimum, it must have these two things. The name attribute is the fully qualified package name of the fragments class. When we insert the fragment into the layout XML, the system, when it looks at the activities XML, is going to call on createView in the fragment during the create cycle of the activity, as we saw in the previous slide. And what that will do is cause the fragments on createView method to be called. And then in that method, we are responsible for inflating the fragments layout. So a fragment tag within the layout XML of an activity is a placeholder for what actually will be going on. It's a view group. It's a container for the actual XML or the layout or the view of the fragment that will be displayed. So on createView must be implemented in every fragment that has a view. We already know that. It must return the root view of the fragment's layout. So we have the activity layout. It has a fragment tag inside it. And then we have the fragment layout that will go into that placeholder fragment tag in the activity. Three parameters, you will get three parameters to deal with in on createView. They're provided for you. First of all, you're going to get a layout inflator, and we use that to inflate and return the root view of the fragment. We get a view group, which is really kind of a pointer to the fragment tag within the activity layout, but that view group is the container, and it's called container in the parameter list, in which the fragments layout will be inflated. And then we get a bundle object, which we can use to extract a previous state in on createView for that fragment and restore it. So inflating a layout is a pretty simple process. Inflation in Android is the process of translating the XML file into an actual view class. The process of inflation happens all the time. Anytime we have a view XML, it is being inflated, whether we know it or not. In an activity, that process is happening in the background for us. But if we want to add an XML file to a container, we need to inflate it using the inflate method. And the inflate method takes three parameters. It takes the ID of the view or the layout to be inflated. It takes a container in which to inflate that layout. And it takes a Boolean that says whether or not the layout will be attached to the container during the inflation. That Boolean should be false when we're inflating a fragment in this way, because if we already have a fragment tag in the activity XML and we already have a fragment class that points to, the system has already attached that to the fragment tag. And so it should be false. We don't want a double attachment. We don't want another view in there. If we do it in code, this third parameter should be true because it's not already attached. So how do we access a particular control within a fragment? Well, we can still use Find View by ID, but there's kind of a hitch here. In order to find the view, we need the layout of the fragment. And so we need the root view of that fragment's view. So we need to call getView in order to resolve that root view. And that looks like this. Suppose we have a text view called RID text view within our fragment. We would do it the same way. We'd cast a Find View by ID RID text view to a text view and return that. But we need to resolve the view, the fragment's view, using getView before we can call Find View by ID. All right. So now we have enough information to proceed with sort of a overview type demo of how fragments work. Thank you very much.